on. Hello, Brubs. We're back with The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Heinz Ewers, a 1927 translation of an earlier book. I don't know which year it was originally. Translation by Ludwig Levison. Illustrations by Mablon Blaine. And we go to chapter 11. Chapter 11. Just like bankruptcy. This is moral bankruptcy. Chapter 11. Wem sieht wei igweek. I can't read German, so you're just going to have to. Und ewigkeit wei seit. I don't know how to read it. And there's the drop cap. Other satanic looking one. The late September sun burned the valley. The lake steamed, and the naked cliffs reflected the glow. The grass shriveled on the stones, and men crept wearily about in this seething kettle. Frank Braun was still in Val d'Escogia. He had sent his boxes and trunks to the city. They were in storage on the pier. Thus they would be at hand the moment he arrived there and wanted to leave. This gave him a certain feeling of security. Now he could get away at any moment, but he loitered from day to day. He tried several times to be alone with Teresa. She did not exactly avoid him, but she did not meet his wishes in any way, and she was always surrounded by the devil hunters. The dumb boy seemed to cleave to her garments. Early in the morning came Pietro Nascler, usually in the company of several others. A young girl, Carmelina Gaspari, a cousin of the veneer woman, was about her all day. She attended to her room, which Teresa scarcely left any longer. Late in the afternoon, the whole village would assemble, and finally they would proceed, under her leadership, to the prophet's hall. No one seemed to pay any attention to Frank Braun. Instinctively, quite without discussing it amongst themselves, they kept apart from him. Formerly, everyone had greeted him respectfully on the streets. The children ran after him to get a kreuzer. The women and girls peeped at him out of doors and windows, and the men begged for a cigarette. It seemed an honor if he spoke to them. Now they scarcely saw him. They greeted him if he passed by and could not be avoided, but rather stepped aside or talked loudly to someone else in order to seem not to notice him. Ramonde still abased himself before the power of his money, but in his eyes lay a poorly concealed contempt. The American avoided him shyly. Whenever he saw him, and in the village slumbered a silent hostility and hidden hatred. Only Angelo, the farmhand, seemed unchanged. He laughed and grinned a broad grin like a timid animal, beaten often, who knew that he had nothing to fear here. Friendly enough, and yet without losing a final timidity, maybe even he will strike someday after all. He hid his head in the sand, he did his work, and slept and fed, and all these things didn't concern him. Sometimes, of an evening, Frank Braun would present him with a bottle of wine. Then he went into the stable, lay down on the straw next to the goat, and drank. Even the children avoided him. When he called out to Fiammetta Veneer to untie the boat, she ran away. A 4-year-old boy, the cobbler Ratty's child, begged, and he gave him a few copper coins. But his sisters struck the money out of his hand, seized his arm, and ran away with him. Thus the thought germinated in the valley. He is a stranger. It broke out everywhere simultaneously, grew like a flood, and covered the broad plain. He doesn't belong to us. He is a stranger. And then it ate in. Like an acid. He was the stranger and an enemy. Everyone knew of his relations with Teresa. They had formerly accepted them as a matter of course, and the young wenches had envied her. But now she was a saint, and the peasants felt he had defiled her. They didn't reflect, but this hatred grew in them. There were but two creatures who remained faithful to him, the black tomcat and the goat, Marfa. They were glad when he returned. They came to his room daily, and when he went out, they followed him. The peasants thought, "What Christian is good to animals? He is no Christian." And a hidden rage was mixed with their hatred. In the evening, when they all came to Raymonde's house, he was accustomed to go out, and the animals ran with him. Then the people struck out at them and kicked them with their heavy boots behind his back. One afternoon he had been rowing on the lake. When he came home, he found the tomcat lying before his door. It was covered with blood, its nose severed by a mighty blow from a knife. It had been stabbed all over, and 4 ribs were broken. The animal had dragged itself up to his door and died as he carried it to the room. A fiery rage seized him, and he raced down the stairs. Before the house stood the people. The tailor had grouped them, as he did every evening, in a wide semicircle. Frank Braun stepped up to them. "Which of you killed the tomcat?" None answered. Those in the front row gazed on the ground in dumb cowardice, but from the back row sounded a thin, hateful titter, and Girolamo Scuro, who stood on one side, drew up his face in broad laughter. The German went up to him. "Was it you?" he hissed at him. The huge fellow retreated a step. "No," he said hesitatingly, "I know nothing about it." But he continued to grin, and his red goiter was puffed up like a gobbler's wattle. Frank Braun raised his hand. "Take this," he cried, and give it to the scoundrel who killed the cat. He aimed well, and his fist came down with full force on the fellow's nose, so that the blood spurted out at once. The man howled with pain and threw himself upon him, but Frank Braun gave him a mighty blow in the stomach, so that the other collapsed and writhed, and a third blow on his head felled him to the earth. Another of the men who jumped at him he grasped by the right hand, twisted his arm about quickly, and threw him to the ground. Then he whistled to the goat. It leaped out of the stable and ran after him. He pushed the people roughly aside to the right and to the left. They retreated and formed a lane for him. No one dared to touch him. Thus he strode with the animal through the crowd. He climbed into the olive groves, his breast heaving. "That did me good," he murmured. "That did me a lot of good." He sat down on the grass and took sugar out of his pocket. "There, eat, Marfa," he said. "Don't be afraid. They won't hurt you. You yield milk. You're an investment. They would have to pay Raymonde if they killed you. But Fritz, you see, was not an investment. He was only a tomcat. He only ate and gave no return, so he was worth nothing. For that reason, these pious people went at him. For that reason." He trembled with rage. Oh, he intended to tame them, these mountain cattle. They were to jump and to kiss his whip. His blood cried out and demanded wildly the might of a master over this lower race. But then a quiet melancholy came over him. To what end? To what end? What satisfaction was it to thrust his riding whip into their faces? And how cheap was this pride in the thought that he was a being of higher type? He stroked the white goat. He plucked small green leaves for her, led her to the blackberry bushes. He ate the berries, and she ate the tender shoots. "If I were a fawn," he said, "if I had 2 horns and hairy goat's legs and a long beard like you, I'd like to have 7 goat maidens and live among them and play the flute. Sometimes in the evening, I'd make my way to the lake where the girls wash linen. Ah, you needn't bleat, old Marfa. What is there to a human girl? Can she jump and climb over the steepest cliffs? Pshaw! One hunts them and catches them, and takes them and lets them run again." From the barn came discordant sounds. "Do you hear them, Marfa? They sing and pray, and they do not even know what laughter is. But we know it well, we fawns and goats and great Pan in his bushes." He returned to the inn. At the stable door stood Angelo. The goat ran up to him, reared, and laid her hooves on his shoulder. The fellow grinned in an almost embarrassed way. With his clumsy paw he scratched her neck. "You were out walking again with the goat, sir?" he asked. A strange quiver lay in his question, like a gleam of quiet knowledge and understanding. Frank Braun looked at him astonished. Hello, Brobs. What do you mean? He asked. Angelo stammered, turned red as a poppy, and grinned in his broad, stupid way. Then he took the goat, went into the stable, and disappeared in the darkness. Try it. Ask a question. If you were a font, there you go. Answer the damn question. Where was I? Went into the stable and disappeared in the darkness. Frank Braun, all right, that's done. Frank Braun looked after him. Poor fellow, and you must serve among Christian people. He went to his room. He saw at once that someone had been there. His table was in disorder, the books disarranged, the papers shoved aside as though someone had been looking for something. He opened the drawer. His revolver was gone. So that's what they were afraid of. His nostrils expanded. His upper lip drew itself in ironically, as though he needed a pistol for these cattle. He went down and ate. Then he hurried to the American's hall. He went softly and stood behind one of the diagonal beams that supported the wall. Again, Pietro Nascler had made certain changes. On all the walls and beams had now been fastened pasteboard placards with pious sayings. Along the whole rear wall, at about human height, long nails had been driven, from which hung the scourges, whips, rods, and cudgels. There were several dozen. One saw that the prophet had many disciples. Beneath these, a platform about a foot in height had been built of boards. From this, one could now, to some extent, look down on the audience. And there, under the image of Christ, stood Teresa's chair. She reclined on it with her eyes closed, and with a little crucifix, as always, in her hand. At her feet crouched Gino. To the right sat the prophet. At her left stood the old, weather-beaten Alpo. She looks like an extinguished light, Frank Braun thought. Near Alpo stood the tailor Ranchi. He stood in front of the band, which occupied the entire side of the platform. Next to the American sat Girolamo Scuro. The right side was occupied by more than a dozen young fellows, each of whom held a great candle in his hand. Before them stood the deformed Ratty, who beat time to their singing with his saber. When the song was ended, Matilda Veneer stepped on the platform and confessed her soul. She was followed by Carmelina Gaspari, who, with tears, accused herself of having formerly spoken evil of the saint. He thought, if only Teresa doesn't confess her soul, but she did not move and did not even open her closed eyelids. Now Veneer's wife drove her daughter forward. Little Fiammetta did not hesitate, sprang swiftly up the steps, bowed her head, closed her eyes, folded her hands, and prayed aloud. Then she began, stuttering a little at first, but soon becoming fluent, bubbling out impudently and hastily what she had been taught to say. Her guilt was great, she said, because she was not her father's child, but had been conceived by her mother in iniquity, and she had been begotten by the frontier guard, Herr Alois Drenker, who was a drinker and a sinner and a son of Satan. Now, however, I am saved, she closed, and I thank the Lamb that my mother and I are on the way to heaven. And it is our desire to fight against the devil until we die, but my father is not yet wholly saved, and I beg you, my dear fellow fighters, to pray for him, that he may come to Jesus and be saved for the sake of the cross. Amen. Frank Braun spat out. A bitter taste lay on his tongue. The walls should cave in from sheer disgust, he murmured. He looked sharply at Teresa, but not a muscle in her face quivered. Did she know nothing of all that went on about her? A young fellow confessed his soul, then Ratty and Maria Grazia, Olpo's daughter. Frank Braun thought, is no one going to get up and confess that he killed the tomcat? But he reflected that they were Christians, and that was no sin. That was no sin. Teresa moved her hand and spoke thoughtfully. The American and old Olpo stretched their heads to listen. Scuro and Ranchi approached too. They nodded. Then the tailor went forward and said they were to sing the fasting song in closing. So they were through for this evening. Frank Braun stepped out of the hall into the night air, but he waited. He wanted to see Teresa and talk to her, in spite of the people. They sang all the 7 stanzas and 5 times over the refrain of each stanza. He strode up and down indifferently. Finally, they finished and came crowding out of the door. At last came Teresa. Her feet were bare. With her left hand, she leaned lightly on the boy's shoulder, but she turned to the right, stared straight toward the house of the prophet. About her were the women, Celestina, the wife of Pietro, then Carmelina, Matilda Veneer, and Maria Grazia. Several men, too, entered the house. Pietro Nascler followed slowly, talking to his servant. Frank Braun approached them swiftly and barred the door before they entered. He shoved the farmhand aside with his elbow, then he seized the American by the arm. I want to speak with you, Pietro, he said quietly. See that you get out of my way, Skirl. The man hesitated. Then Frank Braun turned to him. Must I beat you again? Go. Growling, the gigantic fellow stepped into the house. The prophet looked aside shyly. What do you want with me? He asked. Why did you come back? Frank Braun answered, That doesn't concern you. I shall question you, and you will answer me. Do you hear? Yes, said the prophet, grinding his teeth. Then tell me this. Does Teresa confess her soul? The American shook his head. No, he answered. Why should a saint confess her soul? Does she scourge herself? Frank Braun asked further. Mr. Peter was silent. Answer me, he demanded. Why don't you come to our meetings? Said Pietro. You are free. Anyone may come and see what she does. Frank Braun seized him by the coat. No subterfuges. Does she use the scourge? Yes, Pietro admitted. Frank Braun breathed quickly. His heart seemed to be beating in his mouth. She uses the scourge, he repeated slowly. Whom does she strike? The American tried to get away. Sir, he cried impatiently, she uses the scourge of the Lord against all her brothers and sisters. She strikes the sinful flesh and pours the blood for him who died on the cross. A red mist seemed to settle over Frank Braun's eyes. But he did not let the American go. He held him. However, he writhed. And you people, he asked, do you strike her too? Mr. Peter shook his head vehemently. Would we strike the saint? He released him. He could have embraced him for these words. But his distrust vanished for only a moment and returned again at once with double intensity. He asked quickly, What is she doing in your house now? I don't know, Pietro stammered. Then Frank Braun held his fist under the man's eyes. Speak, you dog, he hissed. Do you want me to crush your skull? The prophet trembled in pitiable fear. Sir, I do not know. I don't know. I really don't know. It is the first time that she has come to my house. She said to me suddenly that God the Lord was in her, and that she had to withdraw immediately from all men. Then I asked her whether perhaps she would come to my house, and she nodded. Thus it was. He realized that Pietro was speaking the truth, so he released him. I will enter with you, he said. The American looked at him with extreme malevolence, but dared not argue. Together they entered the house. At the farther end of the hall, he saw Teresa sitting on the bench by the stove. Only the boy was close beside her. All the others kept at a distance from her. It seemed that the saint wished it so. There were probably 10 people in the room. They regarded him with curiosity and suspicion when he entered, but no one said a word. It had been his intention to approach her and address her at once, but he saw that her eyes were fixed on nothingness, that her spirit was removed from all that went on about her. So he sat down on a chair close by the window, leaned his elbows on his knees, supported his head in his hands, and looked over at her. No one spoke. They all waited for something that was to happen. Teresa held the crucifix firmly in her hands, but her eyes looked beyond it, far away. Then a smile of utter blessedness played about her lips. Slowly she arose, and the crucifix glided from her fingers. It was as though she saw the Lord. She knelt down, arose again, her hands were folded and upraised, and finally she assumed the position of a priest pronouncing the Dominus Vobiscum. Finally she sank upon her knees again and remained so for a long space. Frank Braun did not take his eyes from her, following her smallest gestures. There was no doubt that Teresa was in an intensely visionary state. He pulled up his thoughts as he would a noble horse, grasped the snaffle, and rode into the land of her visions. And he understood her well. She lay in the olive garden and prayed with the Savior. Her face mirrored all the temptations that had oppressed the Son of God in his human character and all his recoiling from suffering and death. And she prayed fervently and wrung herself free from human fears through the might of prayer. Kneeling, she saw and experienced all the pains and torments from the capture at Gethsemane to the crucifixion. She arose from her knees and her body fell backwards. She now lay on her back, spread out her arms, and stretched her naked feet forward. She crossed one foot over the other as though she herself were the lamb upon the slaughtering block of the cross. But then she raised herself up again and kneeling, with tears in her eyes, looked upward, even as the Mother of God looks upward in pain upon her Son. And deep in her breast she felt the sufferings of him who hung on the cross. A horrible fear of death seized her. The power of her limbs was wholly broken. Her face faded to an intenser pallor. One color of life after another died away, but the sacred wounds upon her hands and her feet grew ever more vivid. Her nails became blue, her lips hung flaccid and dry about her open mouth. Her braids were loosened, cold sweat dripped from her forehead and from her hollow cheeks and moistened her locks. Bitter tears broke from her rigid eyes and fell down into great drops. But now there gleamed other red drops on her forehead and mixed with her tears. A bloody diadem surrounded her head, the stigmata of the Redeemer's crown of thorns. Twitchings started from the corners of her open mouth, flashed down like lightning of a near storm and shook her body with the frosts of death. A heavy breathing wrung itself from the heaving breast. Between there came sighs and moans, all the mystic wounds opened like springs. Her face was covered with blood. Her white garment was stained red with the blood from the wound in her side, and long streams of blood flowed from her hands and feet. A sobbing as if of approaching death seized her, ever more violent. Convulsions shook her body, which offered less and less resistance. The moaning and sighing turned into a death rattle. The eyes seemed to burst from their sockets, and the poor body, desperate and worn out, struggled with death attacking everywhere. The excess of all her agony streamed outward from within with increasing force and contorted her face until it was unrecognizable. Then she collapsed. Her arms fell limp, and her jaw dropped wide. From the pallid lips emerged her tongue, dark blue and swollen to an ungainly size in her convulsions. Her lids were set, and from the eyes fled the last gleam amid heavy tears. In short pauses, a violent inward sobbing was heard. Then finally she sank back, totally exhausted by these torments. The last signs of the convulsion disappeared from her face and limbs. She lay as rigid as a dead body. They all looked dumbly at the lifeless form. None stirred from his place. The dumb boy huddled up, crouched under her chair, rigid with fear, scarcely capable of breathing. An epileptic twitching flew over the prophet's face, and a thin saliva trickled from the corners of his mouth. Brief cramps seemed to thrust his body to and fro. His arms flew about in harsh ungainliness. "She is dead," he whispered. "The saint is dead." He was about to hasten to her. With one leap, Frank Braun was at his side, encircled his wrist firmly, and pushed him with a powerful jerk back on the bench. "Don't move," he cried out to him. "Don't move." Pietro Nascler was badly frightened. His teeth rattled and his body trembled, but the threatening attack was extinguished. Quietly, he remained sitting on his bench. After a few minutes, Teresa raised her head again and knelt down in new contemplation. Her face seemed quiet. Every expression of torment had vanished. The eyes opened. She turned about in a semicircle, following with her glances something that moved about her. Then she arose, stood immovably upright, and her glances were turned toward the ceiling. The pupils of her eyes turned upward more, and finally disappeared entirely under the lids. Slowly she raised at the same time the outstretched palms of her hands. Frank Braun regarded her intently. "The vision has gone," he whispered. she is falling into the state of ecstasy. An untroubled joy beamed from the girl's face as though in her jubilation she would embrace the whole world and send her rapture forth to it in kisses. Thus she stretched out her arms and hands and closed them tightly and vigorously as though she would never again let go of that which she held. Her face beamed in a fervent rapture, a fullness of ecstatic joy. Her breast heaved in blessed shudder as of an embrace. And she raised herself to her feet and stood high on the tips of her toes, which seemed scarcely to touch the ground. She seemed to float. Everything in her bore her by an upward impulse into the very air. And very softly her lips sang, "Let us fly away. Let us fly away to eternal joy." There was no longer anything human about her. Frank Braun's eyes opened wide. He devoured her sweet form. He drew it in at every pore. Like pomegranate blossoms gleamed the drops of blood upon her white forehead. Her black tresses fell far down over her naked shoulders. Her white garment, flecked here and there with blood, was billowy as a white cloud upon which the departing sun throws the last greetings of its heart's blood. "Oh, if I were only a painter," he murmured. Suddenly, without transition, she fell to the floor. She lay stretched out on her back, her eyes closed at once. It was as though she had fallen from an infinite height. Still she continued to stretch out her arms, clutching at the air with her hands as though seeking some support. Then her body rose, curved in a violent convulsion like a bow, and rested only on her feet and on the back of her head. The next moment she threw herself around. Now clonic convulsions tugged at her poor limbs. She started up, no longer touching the floor, beat wildly about her with arms and legs, and cried out in a terrible paroxysm. Finally she sprang to her knees, uttered a fearful cry, and pulled out great handfuls of her hair. Ghastly fear, wild despair cried out from her features, and she shrieked, "Oh, the abyss! The abyss!" She crouched down and crept into a corner on all fours like a wild animal hunted to its death. Oh, I shouldn't have drank that water. There she lay motionless through long minutes. Her breathing became quieter and her features calm. The dumb boy crept softly up to her. He knelt before her and seized with his two small hands the edge of her garment. And now life returned to her body. The eyes did not open, but she thrust her head forward and seemed to see the boy through her closed lids. Her cheeks flushed red, her mouth half opened, and a desirous smile lay on her face. She raised her arms a little toward the boy. It was as though she saw before her the lovely body of an angel. Her breast swelled, and a gentle tremor ran through her body. Now she leaned back, lying flat with her head supported against the wall, and gently, scarcely noticeably, she raised her body and under the linen that hid them, drew her legs apart. Her mouth opened and closed as in kisses. A deep sigh of ardent happiness issued from between her white teeth. Frank Braun looked at her, saw these limbs that trembled and melted in supreme rapture, and these lips that drank all passionate blessedness. "Incubus, incubus," he whispered. To be sure, he had often seen her face in such moments, and yet it was different now, an image of such unheard of delight as no earthly embrace could give, and he thought of Bernini's statue in Santa Maria della Vittoria at Rome, of that white stone which represents the apotheosis of Saint Teresa. Yes, just so the girl looked, like the Holy Lady of Avila in the enjoyment of an angelic embrace. To be sure, the angel of the Spanish saint was a beautiful page, a charming cherub of 14, made to be the delight of great ladies. The girl of Scodra had but this poor, emaciated, dumb boy, but in her eyes he had become a lovely youth. Her arms hung limp at her sides, and she drew her knees upward a little, and from the wounds of her feet to those upon her forehead, her body was but a vessel which filled itself with the sweet pains of heavenly love. Incubus, incubus, he repeated. Gradually, through the silent minutes, this great ecstasy receded from her features. Frank Braun stepped up close to her. Heavily, her eyes opened. They now stared upward again, fixed on the ceiling, showing only the whites, but this time it was a fluttering. It was as though she saw before her the lovely body of an angel. There's Teresa. But this time it was a fluttering, a striving upward, internal only and scarcely to be noticed without. Her hands were raised hardly an inch. Thus she lay motionless, stiff, and rigid, but Frank Braun saw clearly that no convulsion held her now, and that her condition was not a cataleptic one. Now she is with God, he whispered. He supported his head in his hands, and his eyes caressed the ecstatic girl. He thought, now you are a statue by the stream of time, and see with eternal eyes the secret of creation. Now you are no longer human, no longer Teresa and a human personality, but one who is nameless and impersonal. Your eye is dead, but your spirit is all embracing, like the nothing and the all. Now you float in emptiness and dwell with the mothers. You have returned into eternity, and your consciousness has grasped itself in its own real character, which no longer knows any form, and holds within itself past, future, and present. This being is a nothingness which embraces everything. It is the motion of the world which proceeds immediately out of itself in order to grasp the inmost character of its own being in eternal purity. If your soul was once a full-blown rose, it has now become a bud. Everything melts, everything dissolves and returns to the primeval beginning. Now you are no longer tormented by horrible visions of crucified gods. Now you are far from them and from all that has life. And you have gained, O happy one, the feeling of the infinite. He sighed deeply. How I envy you, poor girl. Your soul stands before its origin, naked and nameless, without any peculiar being. You have lifted yourself beyond time and know no longer anything of a yesterday or tomorrow, but only of an eternal present. For even the smallest part of all time, the now still has something of the temporal character. But you are above time and the now, and you are above space and have simultaneous knowledge of all things in all farthest worlds. We men think in time, but you have vision of everything in an eternal moment. Time and space are the frontiers which divide us from God. These you have crossed, and your soul gains its knowledge beyond space and time. Formless itself, your soul. Did I just break that page corner? Bastard. Soul plunges into the formless deity. For God, as you, thrice happy one, know, is nothing else than your own experience. You are in God, and so you are God. Do you not feel, beloved, how the wings of your soul are growing? A light surrounds you and a lovely warmth which melts all hardness and fixity, and that dreadful heaviness which makes us cling to the crust of the soiled earth. Everything melts into a boundless light and sinks itself into you, and you are the light and the all. He took his handkerchief and covered her face. It is not well for you to be seen, O happy one, he whispered. It is as though one gazed into the sun and yet knew that one might never grasp it. Therefore, one must not desire it. One might become blind if one were to see God. The people who believe in God know nothing of him. To some, he is an intellectual concept, a cause, a comfortable thing that they have need of for their vision of the world, an unseen motor which makes the wheels turn. To others, his is a great name, like Alexander's or Caesar's or Napoleon's. He is a hero like these, with this difference, that he is still alive. One must reckon with him and his power, and compromise with it, as with that of the tax gatherer and of the policeman. It is only the saints who know God. They do not believe what they hear from others. They see with their own eyes and hold with their own hands. They know God from the depths of an immediate experience, as one knows a flower or a cup of wine. As others experience love, so they experience God. Slowly he went up and down in the room. He approached Pietro and put a hand on his shoulder. I am thirsty, he said. Give me a drink of water. The American got up and spoke to his wife. She went out and remained away for a while. Frank Braun grew impatient. Go see what your wife is doing. Is it so hard to get a mouthful of water in this house? Pietro went himself and at last brought in the water. The German took the glass and raised it to his lips. Then a sudden suspicion seized him, and he lowered it again. You drink first, he said. Why? The prophet asked. I am not thirsty. Drink, he commanded. He saw how Pietro took a deep draught. I was mistaken, he thought. How did I come to think of that? He drained the glass hastily. Teresa had not yet moved. Gino had crept close up to her and was chafing her ice-cold feet. The men and women, growing calmer through the quietness of the saint, stood or sat in groups and whispered softly. Celestina Nascler went about and distributed wooden cups full with milk. Will you not let us partake of the blood of the lamb? Asked the prophet's servant. But Pietro shook his head. Then the girl stirred. The kerchief fell from her face, and she looked about in astonishment. Am I here? She asked softly. They all crowded up to her. Veneer said, Yes, sister, you are with us now, but where were you? Teresa did not answer. They lifted her and placed her on the bench. Carmelina Gaspari fetched large pillows and shoved them behind her back. She seemed weak and tired, but her eyes had a clear and free look. With her fingers she made signs to the boy. He jumped up quickly and brought her a cup of milk from the table. She took it and thanked him, but scarcely moistened her lips. Veneer was urgent. Holy sister, will you not tell us what you have seen? Teresa caressed the boy's tousled hair. No, no, she murmured. One cannot express it. One cannot speak of it in human words. Her eyes fell upon Frank Braun. Are you here? She said. Come hither to me. She spoke quietly and gently, but there was a firm sound in that soft voice, which did not command and yet took obedience as a matter of course. He felt that distinctly. Thus he did not answer and did not move from the spot. Then she said quietly, Bring him here to me. The people crowded up. He looked at them in astonishment. They seemed transformed in a moment. He saw their faces. They looked firm and determined, and all timidity had vanished. He turned on his heel and approached the door, but Girolamo Skirl stepped in front of him with outstretched arms. You are to go to her, said he, and Ratty said, Yes, sir, you are to go to her. This little cobbler, who was wont to collapse before him out of sheer terror and respect, now he stood there and opened his eyes wide and clenched his hands, instantly ready to throw himself upon him and to set his teeth in him. Frank Braun remained standing, confused, undecided. What had happened? But a few hours ago he strode among these cowardly peasants, he alone among hundreds of them. With his fist he had beaten his way through, and there was none who dared even open his lips. Let me read that again. With his fist he had beaten his way through, and there was none who dared even open his lips. Now they stood there, threatening and strong, and the weakest among them would attack him without hesitation. He turned about and looked at Teresa. Her eyes were cast down. Her hands gently caressed the boy's head. She did not even look up. All quietude and gracious gentleness lay on the girl. And yet it was she from whom the spirit of resistance proceeded. That was plain. The folk of Val d'Escodra had been a great beast without brain, creeping cowardly and timidly, fleeing at his very glance. But now it had a will, Teresa's will. Now it felt itself strong, opened its maw, and stepped into his path, and did not draw back. The master's voice was lost in the wind now that another master commanded. They stood close about him like a well-built wall. He saw Ranchi turn aside, and he heard the key turn with a hoarse grinding sound. Now he was imprisoned. The force of his will was blown away, and he could throw it away like an old glove. Nothing was left that made him a superior of these peasants. Now it was a question of wild physical combat. He counted them quickly, ratty, raunchy, old Ulpo and the prophet, but the latter was not worth counting. But there was the gigantic Girolamo Scuro, who could now use his slaves' fists unhindered, and the vigorous young Ulpo and Veneer and three other peasants, and there were the women. These women, they would cling to him with their nails and teeth. There was no doubt but that he would be beaten, and even if his wounded pride and his angry contempt should make his muscles as of steel, and even if agility and practice should easily make him master over each individual, nevertheless they would hold him in triumph over him, and in the end even his greatest victory would end in flight. He bit his lips and approached Teresa quietly. She asked him, "Were you here the whole time?" He nodded silently. "What has happened?" she asked further. The questions affronted him. This seemed to him like a judicial examination. Nevertheless, he answered, "You were in a state of ecstasy." She was silent. Slowly she said, "Yes, I have seen God." He waited, then, as she hesitated, he cried brusquely, "What do you want of me? I wish to go. Do you hear me? You stay here alone with your prophet." Then she jumped up vehemently at one bound. She stood close before him. Her hot breath touched his face. Her eyes looked sharply into his. "Do you forget who led me to him?" He was not silent, but accepted the challenge which she offered. "It was I," he cried aloud. "I." He looked to one side, seized the American who stood next to him by the arm, and pulled him forward. "It was I," he repeated sharply. "It was I who made Pietro Nascler a prophet, and you a saint. I played with you as with puppets. You are dancing according to my wires. You are my creatures, lumps of clay into which I breathed my breath." He threw back his head, and his fists were clenched. Now he felt he had strength. Now no one would be able to hold him back. Now he was free. Too bad my fingers aren't free. Teresa looked at him as though she understood his thought. "You want to leave?" she asked quietly. He answered, "It doesn't concern you whether I go or stay. But since you ask, I'll tell you. Day after tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I shall leave by the stage." She smiled quietly. "The stage will leave day after tomorrow at 2 o'clock, but you will not leave." She turned to the others and raised her voice. "Do you hear? He is not to leave by the stage. Tell all the people in the village that he is not to leave." He seized her hand and shook it. "What?" he cried. "I am not to leave. I assure you that I will." She withdrew her hand, let go. She said quietly, "You hurt me." But then she repeated, "You will not belong to me." He laughed in her face. "Really? To you? Look, I always assumed." She looked at him with quiet assurance. "Be still," she said. "Do you want to tell that I was your mistress? But to whom? To me, I know it. Or to the others? Everyone in the whole village knows it. Yes, I have lain in your arms and do not deny it. Nor do I deny what is more, that it was you who showed me the way that leads to God. Do you believe Pietro would deny it?" "He as little as myself." She turned to the latter with her smile of assurance. "Tell him yourself, brother." The American hesitated a moment. Then he spoke aloud. "Yes, he led me upon the path. He told me that the Lord had blessed me with his grace, and that the spirit of the prophet Elijah was alive in me. He taught me what power God had placed in the blows of the scourge, and how in my hand the wine would be transformed into the blood of the Lamb." "Do you hear it?" said Teresa. "And so I also will tell what you did. It was you who took me to the prophet's hall. You alone. You know that I didn't want to go, and only obeyed out of my love for you. And it was you who spoke to me of all the things that I did not know. You told me of the lives of the saints who bore the wounds of our Lord and saw his face. It was you alone. And if the high gate of all grace opened in Val d'Escogia, it was you who brought us the key." Her voice rose and sounded bright and clear in great full tones. "We know well that it was the Lord who sent you, but we know also that you alone do not believe in his power. You were his tool and thought you were master. Because you unlocked the gate to the realm of all splendor, you deemed that it was your kingdom. But now all enter through that lofty gate, and you alone must remain without." Her words sounded prophetical. She raised her arms high and very gently rocked her head to and fro. Difficult is the way that leads upward. full of thorns and jagged shards. The thorns tear our naked feet, and blood flows as from a sparkling spring. But I go that way, and above, a bright light is radiant. There the heavenly bridegroom will embrace the bride. Thither, 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 my sight aspires and does not see the snake that creeps amid the stones. It will sting me, it will sting me, but my feet stride farther upward, upward. Her eyes glowed and her hand touched his temples. You are that snake, she conquered. You are that snake, she cried. You will sting me. But then, when the last pain is conquered, when the flesh is overcome, come, and the blessed soul rejoices in the kiss of the bridegroom, then you will stand below and look up, and the worm of suffering will devour you. Eternally you will cleave to the lowliness of the earth's soiler. Restlessly will you wander through all lands, unquiet, joyless, without end. She breathed deeply and let herself fall heavily back on the bench. She closed her eyes and was silent for a little space. Then her lips moved again, softly, almost whispering. Frank Braun had to bow his head to understand what she said. I see you fleeing with eternal death at your back, over hills and lakes, through long valleys and broad plains. I see you sitting in a spacious square, and the sun streams from the white marble. Round about tall palaces arise, but your eyes are cast down, and someone calls your name. But you hear my voice, and clouds cover the sun. Her whisper died, and her lips still moved a little without sound. He took her hands. Tell on, Teresa. Tell me what you see then. She twitched and raised herself up, as though she were awakening from sleep. I do not know, she said softly. I do not know. Then she arose. Oh, I am tired. Take me home. Carmelina Gaspari approached softly and supported her. Teresa laid her right arm heavily over the other's shoulder and moved forward. Good night, sisters, she cried. Good night, brothers. Pray for me. Gino proceeded. All the others followed, accompanying her home. Slowly, Frank Braun walked behind. He went down to the shore, untied the boat, and rowed out. He used the oars with all his strength, seeking, in this physical exertion, an outlet for his hot excitement. But he did not succeed. He returned after an hour, and his pulse throbbed no less. The house was surrounded on all sides. Under his window, he saw Scuro standing. Young Ulpo and his friend Pasquale Pederzoli sat on the steps before the door. Frank Braun addressed them. You are watching me. Wouldn't you rather go to sleep? Ulpo answered. The saint has commanded us. We can sleep later. In 3 hours we will be relieved. He stood up and made way for him to reach the door. So you're willing to let me go in? Frank Braun asked, but not out of the house again, I suppose. Oh, yes, sir, answered the fellow. You may go out. You may go wherever you please in the village and in the gardens. You may also go out on the lake, but always 12 will follow you and not let you leave. Ratty decided it so. Frank Braun laughed. Ratty, the night watchman. So Ratty was the commander-in-chief, and he himself the prisoner of the little hunchback cobbler. Is Ratty here? He asked. Yes, sir, said Ulpo. He's lying on a bench in the guest room. Shall I call him? The German stepped into the house and went into the guest room. Ratty was not asleep. He sat by the lamp, his rosary in his hand. Frank Braun approached him and drew a banknote from his pocket. Here are 1,000 crowns, he said. Do you want them? Let me leave tonight, and you will get the money. The little cobbler turned around. You are the tempter, he said. You are the Antichrist. Very well, said Frank Braun, just as I expected. Good night, Ratty. He went to his room whistling. His offer had not been serious. He had not for a moment expected the other to accept it. Only one will ruled in Val d'Escodre, and that was Teresa's will. He undressed slowly. How changed everything was. How inside out everything had turned. He had been the center about which everything circled. He had stood still and been the sun about which the world of Val d'Escodre fervently turned. And Teresa had been but a mote carried along in the wild whirl about him. But now the dead star had its own life and light. He was the cold moon, long dead, held and bound in the strict fetters of that sun's majesty. Was it not his fire which nourished her? Was it not his good light which she had stolen? He shook his head. Oh no, it was her own innermost life and light. He had but ignited and awakened it. He himself had always been dead, cold, and rigid, an unsightly mass of fog which puffed itself up and flew toward the sun. She was the true and strong sun. To be sure, he had good eyes. She did not blind him as she did all the others. He could look into the depths of her heart, and her beams did not singe him, but broke before his glance. What was all the noise about? Her stigmata did not worry him. They were common event. They were no common event, to be sure, but nothing extraordinary. It gave him little trouble to explain them. Then there was her clairvoyance. She had spoken strange words to him which pointed to something in the near or distant future, but he could well discard those for the present. Only if a light were really to be kindled from her stammering, then only need he reckon with it, then only seek and digging. What? Then only need he reckon with it, then only seek and dig for reasons and connections. Until then they were but words, the confused words of one in a state of hallucination, worthless chaff. Also, her sacred vision was something petty and explicable enough. His mind need not delay over things which could seem supernatural only to poor fools. And the apotheosis, the incubus, the angel who drew her to the couch on which Mary had lain, pshaw, it was something great only for the artist that lived in his eye, but something very inconsiderable for the scholar in his brain. So there remained but one thing, the state of ecstasy. There was no doubt that Teresa Raimondi had achieved the state of ecstasy on this night. With this she left far behind her Louise Lateau, Marguerite Alacoque, Maria of Merle, and the ecstatic maiden of the Tyrol. All that those experienced and that good people called ecstasy, all that these experienced and that good people called ecstasy, was nothing but simple religious vision. They saw what everybody sees in devotional pictures, what every child hears from its priest, but they never saw God. The ecstasies of Saint Teresa were, to be sure, purer and more authentic, but even with them was frequently blended the disturbing element of mere Christian vision. Perhaps there was but one among all the women, Sister Catri. But how was it now? Where should he find a breach through which to penetrate into this highest temple and hurl the insolent torch of destruction? He took another image. This ecstasy was Ophir, Solomon's land of gold, or the mysterious copper city of which the Senussi tell, of Atlantis, which the sea swallowed, or El Dorado, or the land of Bimini, which the conquistadores sought. Somewhere that land must lie, and so there must be a way that leads to it. He weighed possibilities. The psychic was not to be separated from the facts of physiology, and if the theory of descent held good for the properties of the body, it must hold good for those of the soul. If through the development of billions of years the protoplasm has become man, if bones and muscles, blood and nerves were formed, transformed, and changed, the form of consciousness must also have altered its character. But just here lies the kernel of all ecstasy, namely that in persons capable of it, consciousness undergoes a change. So was it not possible to find this different type of consciousness somewhere among the rungs of the long developmental ladder? Then he thought of Faust and softly declaimed, "Two souls, alas, are lodged within my breast, which struggled there for undivided reign, one to the world with obstinate desire and closely cleaving organs, still adheres above the mist, the other doth aspire with sacred vehemence to purer spheres." There it was, not two souls that are separate, to be sure, but one soul which turns into another. A soul which suffers nostalgia for the degradation of its ancestors, which yearns out of the free air into the dull caverns of lowly forebears. Goethe might call them lofty in his image, all he pleased. Yet it was the same wise instinct which led him latter to the mothers. In this sense, the soul of man was merely the consciousness of the antithesis between the I and the external world. No one had undertaken to question that since Descartes. The lowest type of animal, however, had neither brain nor nervous system. A stimulus on its surface released merely an immediate effect. The beginning of consciousness might have lain at some point where special parts of the body developed merely in order to transmit the stimulus to other parts which responded to its reaction. There was not the smallest brain at this point, but probably the first nerves which immediately transmitted the stimulus without any gathering point. The animal neither saw nor felt the food particles swimming in the water. Only purely external chemical or mechanical stimuli caused the effect without any perception or willing. Hence, it was impossible that such an animal should have a consciousness like ours, and grasp the antithesis between the I and the external world. Its consciousness must necessarily have been a feeling of the oneness of itself and the world. So far as this animal was concerned, there were no frontiers between the two. But this was the very conception of all ecstasy. It obliterated all boundaries and merged man with the all, and the all with man. Braun recognized this and sought for some physiological element that might point the way to this conclusion. What elements were there in this ecstasy that were other than a normal condition and thus might offer him some handle? Few enough to be sure, and yet these might suffice. In the first place, there was that feeling of floating and flying. Everybody had experienced this in dreams, and were not dreams allied to ecstasy. 100 reports told of men who flew through the air. Gautama Buddha and Maha Samata floated. Plato's pupil, Iamblichus, I don't know how to say that, lifted himself 10 yards above the ground. The history of Christian ecstasies was full of the accounts of pious persons whose bodies arose freely like the body of Teresa. Here, as always, it was Christian mysticism that went deepest and produced results far greater and more wonderful than all the Indian and Egyptian saints. Saint Christina of Saint Proud flew far over towns and villages unto heaven, and the Acta are full of the depositions of citizens and peasants who saw the blessed flyer float through the air. What did it matter whether the accounts concerning Saint Christina, whose flight Diepenbeck painted, and the accounts of all other Christian and heathen flying were objectively true or not? Subjectively, they were certainly true, just as everyone could say, I flew in a dream, so the saints could say with all truthfulness, I flew in ecstasy. And it was beyond all doubt that these pious persons lost the sensation of weight in their consciousness. Another sensation took its place, that of weightlessness. The consciousness of equilibrium. No being that lived in air could have this. It could only arise when the specific gravity of a body was approximately the same as that of the surrounding element. The fishes had it, our lowest ancestors, and as in the case of a swimmer, his lungs again function like the air bladder from which they originally developed. So in the central organ of our nervous system, there may be present extremely ancient vestigial remnants which, in the condition of ecstasy, reawaken the long sensation of equilibrium. The other element was the light. All persons in a state of ecstasy beheld it, and to all it was the greatest happiness and the highest bliss. But they perceived it not with the eye, they felt it also with closed lids and in the dark. It was an inner light which they did not see but felt. Was this not the same thing that our ancestors did billions of years ago? Those animals whose whose eyes neither saw nor differentiated objects, but only served as light-preserving organs, which were assigned to central parts and received this phenomenon of light as a mere stimulus. How many things did the human body contain which have died away slowly but live on uselessly through thousands of years, vestiges of an ancient time? Organs which once fulfilled some function and which now apparently meaningless, seem to exist only to give rise to some disease condition. But if these, like the appendix, had a pathologically harmful effect upon the total organism, was it not possible that in other respects, and under other circumstances, they might exert an influence too? Perhaps the pineal gland was the remnant of some old organ of sense. Now the chain was finished. He lacked but one link to explain the possibility that the human consciousness could change for moments, that it could revert to earlier developmental stages. He did not have to seek long in this direction, for every day offered him many examples. Did not lust, rage, or terror, did they not show again and again the vestiges of primitive, animal, instinctive actions together with the type of consciousness that accompanied these? So close was the connection here between the physical process and the state of consciousness that the two could not be separated, and the passion in question arose out of the closest blending of the two. If one were to subtract from terror its physical symptoms, if one were to let the pulse beat quietly, the glance be firm, the motion swift and certain, the color normal, speech vigorous, and thought clear, why, what of terror would be left? And so, in the case of a person dying of thirst or of hunger, the contemporary form of consciousness tends to disappear, and in its place comes some ancestral form which we call instinct. But all these effects are related to ecstasy. Plotinus said that even animals during the procreative act had visions and yearned after an eternal contemplation. Goethe would have called this the feeling of lofty ancestors, and yet it remained that of lower ancestors, a backward, not a forward impulse, but in the case of all saints, ecstasy was the final conclusion of the highest rapture. Hunger, thirst, castigation, these were always the means toward the great end. Panic fear and berserker rage, how often did they precede ecstasies? And music and drunkenness and all stimuli toward violent emotion must serve here too. Thus ecstasy was the pinnacle, or more truly, the uttermost abyss. All violent emotions tend to make man's consciousness approach that of a beast. The ecstasy led to the deepest point at which lay the consciousness of the oneness between the individual and the world. Frank Braun breathed deeply. He took the kernel of it all in his hand. Ecstasy was a reversal to the condition of the lowest animal life, in which stimuli did not occasion the formation of representations, but released the reaction immediately. It was as much atavistic event as the birth of a child with a cleft palate, or of a horse with divided hooves. It was a condition in which the will and the representative faculty were undivided and all the frontiers of the external world obliterated. A condition that lacked the marks of the perception of space and time and the consciousness of individual willing. It lacked the reciprocal influence of the non-I upon the I and vice versa. It was without perception or will, and so it happened that the I absorbed the non-I and became a pure I. It became God, and that was the ultimate atavism of the human race. Frank Braun got up, went to the window, and looked long into the colossal quietude of the night. Surely he was the victor now, but this victory gave him no joy, and he felt that every possibility lay only in defeat. And in the last analysis, pure happiness was the only thing worth striving for, and was worth far more than even the most glorious victory in the realm of consciousness. Pure happiness, it lay ever behind and never before him. When, in the struggle for existence, the first animals emerged from the water and accustomed themselves to life on dry land, the wet element remained undoubtedly the idea of their existence. When the creatures of night, in order to avoid starvation, conquered their abhorrence of the light, surely brightness was an evil to them, and the dark happiness. This was the eternal falsehood of the good old time. Whenever man desired to be happy, he climbed down from the higher rung on which he stood. He took refuge in intoxication and lust and became an animal, but he was happy in such periods. And so ecstasy, the lowest plane to which man's consciousness can return, affords him at the same time the highest happiness. But there is one thing that shatters all else, knowledge, and the free spirit, incurably delivered over to clear cognition, can no longer hide anything or betray anything, and the heart is broken forever. Something drove him to Teresa. He went out of his room and knocked at her door. He heard a whispering, and then the pushing back of the latch. Carmelina Gaspari stood before him, a candle in her hand. "What do you want, sir?" she whispered. "Give me the candle," he said. He took it and stepped up to Teresa's bed. Gino slumbered on the floor at her feet. The saint lay there in deep sleep. She was beautiful as the Mother of God, and her features radiated a great peace and and an eternal happiness. What kind of pose is this? All right, that's the end of chapter 11. That's all, bruvs. No one answered what font they were. That's a shame. It's a goddamn shame.